Good to have you here. My name is Jose. Um, Today, uh, I would like to enlighten you a little bit um, the relationship between alcoholism and childhood trauma. Um, so before I start, uh, I wanna I would like to give you a little information about my experience with both of these in my own life. All right. Now, if you watch any of my videos, then you know that I'm a survivor of child abuse, right? And also, I mentioned in some of my videos that my father was an alcoholic. All right. Uh, so there was a lot of uh, problems with alcohol in my family. My father was an alcoholic. Um, my both of my grandfathers were alcoholics, and uh, and that caused a lot of pain, a lot of misery, abuse. Okay, which I will highlight as we go through through the discussion. All right, but just to set the stage. All right. Uh, there was also plenty of substance abuse uh, in the family, right? Besides alcohol, right? But today we're going to focus on alcohol, alcoholism, and childhood trauma. All right. So, so before we start, I just want to give you some facts about alcoholism. All right, and I will be leaving a links with two websites. That's where I got the information from that I'm speaking of today. Um, and you could definitely check that out for yourself. And there's also more information besides what I'm talking about today. All right, so uh, there are approximately 18 million people, right, suffering from alcoholism in the United States. All right, some from some kind of alcohol use disorder, right? So alcoholism, right, R is when somebody experiences strong cravings, right, for alcohol, right, and an inability to stop drinking once they start, right? A physical reliance, right? A physical dependence on alcohol, right? And there are other symptoms too. There are, health consequences too to drinking alcohol. All right. So remember, an inability to stop drinking, right? Once they start, right? That's the hallmark of an alcoholic, right? Cannot stop at a few beers, right? Have to continue drinking until the person is drunk, and and then what happens from there is usually not good, right? It's usually not good what happens from there. All right. So alcoholism, right, is any drinking of alcohol, which results in significant mental or physical health problems. All right. So just to just to show you how that is highlighted my own family, right? My grandfather on my mother's side, he used to abuse everybody. He used to come home drunk from work and basically physically abuse everyone in the house. Um, Everyone, including his wife, my grandmother, right? Now, to highlight, right, how severe this was, and I mentioned this in one of my other videos, is that I remember when my mother used to take me and my older brother there to visit, my our grandmother's house, and my aunts and uncles were there too at the time. And when they saw my grandfather coming, right, and mind you, they're all grown up, right? They're adults. When they saw him coming, right, they turned their lights off and went hiding, right? Uh, so that's adults, right? This is adults right here, and so it just shows how brutal it must have been, when they were children and my grandfather would come home drunk, right? Because they were still very, very fearful of him, even when they were adults. So that shows how alcohol was affecting my grandfather's mental well-being, right? Because he was abusive towards his whole family, and there was no reason for that. There was no no sensible reason for him to do that. So that shows that his mind was being affected by the alcohol. All right. Um, Now, I mentioned that my father too was an alcoholic, and it also affected his mental state. He could not take care of himself, right? He could not take care of us. We were constantly being kicked out of the house because he would take his money and go drinking instead of caring for his family. Uh, and another thing that I want to point out is that shows how little he was taking care of himself, right? How his mind was affected, um, was that, as far back as I could remember, he only had like a few teeth left, right? His teeth had just rotten all out. And he had a few rotten teeth left. And that's all I remember. I don't remember my father ever having like his real teeth. And that shows, right? That's evidence right there that his mental state was negatively affected by the alcohol, where he was not taking care of himself. Okay. All right. And he could not take care of his family, he could not take care of himself. It was just pretty severe. uh, Now another thing that I want to say about alcohol use, and alcoholism is that alcohol use is also linked with psychosis, right? A person can have psychotic episodes, right, when they're drinking. And I remember when I was a baby. I mean, I don't remember. I remember my mother telling me that when I was a baby, okay, she thought I was possessed, right? She thought I was possessed by an evil spirit, right? I made another video on depression and child abuse, and I mentioned that in that video, that depression is also linked to psychosis, right? And and in that video, I also said that drinking, substance use is also linked to psychosis, right? So my father was the one that told my mother, right? And I was a baby at the time, right? My father was the one that told my mother that I looked kind of strange because I was making faces or something like that. And that's what she got the idea, as far as what she's telling me, right? She got the idea that I was possessed, and then she just ran with it and severely abused me. Uh, you know, that being one of the reasons why she severely abused me. So that shows too that my father's, drinking was affecting his mind, right? He thought that I was a baby, right? An innocent baby, and he thought that I was possessed. He was seeing something that wasn't there. Okay, so he was having some delusions. All right. So that just give you a little bit of, using my own life to give you a little bit of, evidence as to how alcohol can affect the mind. Okay. Now, also, right, drinking too much alcohol, right, can damage, all the organ systems in the body, but especially the brain, like I just talked about, right? the thinking, right? Our thinking, the heart, liver, pancreas, and immune system. Uh, so the liver is the one that we hear the most about, right? Um, I had a friend that died recently, right? Maybe about a year ago. She was only 42 years old, and she died of liver failure, right? She had a drinking problem, and she couldn't stop. She just couldn't stop drinking. She would get like what they call, alcohol sick. That's They call it alcohol sick. The person starts shaking, right? They don't have alcohol, right? In the morning, right? They start shaking. So that's how bad it was for her. Okay. So yeah. So it can affect major organs. Result in mental illness, irregular heartbeat, an impaired immune response, and liver cirrhosis, right? What I just explained, my friend, she died of liver failure, okay? Liver failure. Uh, and, okay, and increased cancer risk, right? So my grandfather, right, going back to my grandfather, on my mother's side, he he drank, you know many years, right? He drank, very heavy drinker, used to drink rum, Puerto Rican rum, called Palo Viejo, right? And he basically, that's all he did when he came from work. He was drunk all the time. And my mother said to me that, you know, that when he died, when his last days, right, he got something went wrong with his body, right? Something went wrong that the pain was so severe that he used to walk around the house naked, right? Just completely naked, right? And in a lot excruciating pain, right? I think she said something about that he used to crawl on the floor too, basically behaving like a baby. Um, but she never really told me exactly what was the illness, right? But I highly suspect that it was related to his alcoholism. Okay, so um, so we talked about that, right? About how the alcohol can affect the mind, how alcohol can affect uh, organs in the body. All right. So what about, what causes alcoholism, right? What causes a person to become an alcoholic, right? To develop a problem with alcohol. What causes that? Well, um, environmental, environmental factors, and genetics, right? Both, right? What's going on in the home and what is our DNA makeup, right? And each is responsible for half of the risk factor, right? What goes on at home is responsible for 50% of the risk of developing alcoholism, and our DNA is responsible for 50% of the risk. Okay, so environmental factors, right, can include social factors, cultural, high stress in the home, and anxiety. All right, so when I see social cultural factors, right, I think about my father. One of his idols uh, was a singer called Felipe Rodriguez, right? And basically everything that Felipe Rodriguez sang about was drinking, right? The life of the bar with the friends. And that was my father's idol, right? And that shows the cultural aspect of drinking, right? It was like, it was the manly thing to do, right? To go to the bar and be with the friends and talk about, you know all type of things, and but it was like a cultural thing, right, to drink in those days. It probably still is. I think it still is to this day, right? The culture that one is surrounded with, right? Especially our family, right? The culture within the family. And then remember, I said stress, right? Also an environment full of stress, and anxiety, right? And so in my family, there was plenty of stress, plenty of anxiety, abuse, a lot of spousal abuse, a lot of child abuse. So there was a lot of stress in my family through the generations, with my parents, in our home, with my grandparents, their home, their children, my uncles, everybody pretty much, mostly everybody, and everybody was definitely affected. All right. So since there was a lot of stress, and also of financial stress too, okay, which is linked. They both, financial stress will put a family at high risk for child abuse. Okay, so definitely, there was a lot of stress in my family through the generations, which explains, why there was alcoholism and substance abuse, right? With other members of the family. Okay, so what happens? Okay, so let's look at trauma, right? What is trauma, right? When children experience, right, child traumatic stress, right, they are exposed, right, to one or more traumas over the course of their lives, right? And these traumas, uh, trigger reactions, right, in the child, right? And these reactions, right, I'm talking like depression, anxiety, PTSD, to name a few. These reactions, right, persist even long after the trauma has ended. All right? Long after it has ended, right? So, from my own life, right, I was traumatized, I was abused, and anxiety has been part of my life as far back as I can remember, right? It persists to today, to this day, right? Anxiety, hypervigilance, right? Feelings of unworthiness, right? Sometimes feelings of hopelessness, right? Um, so that is the effects, right, of my own trauma, right? And one or more, right? I have multiple traumatic events in my young life, my childhood, different types of abuse, and multiple times. So I definitely can relate to this definition of trauma, right? What is trauma? Okay, very good. So now we know, right? We know what trauma is, what are the effects of trauma, right? And trauma can be emotional and physical abuse, leaving us with uh, with significant mental health issues and addictive patterns, right? So in my own life, right, I was diagnosed with depression. I was diagnosed with you know uh, general anxiety disorder. Uh, so it definitely affected my own mental state. And now addictive patterns. Yes, like I mentioned, right? There was a lot of abuse in my home, and there was a lot of substance abuse in the home, right? Uh, like I mentioned, my grandparents and other people in my family uh, addicted to illegal drugs, and things like that. Now, as far as I'm concerned, right, I did get addicted to alcohol. It wasn't an everyday thing, but when I drank, it was to the point where I got drunk. It did cause me problems. It resulted in problems in my life. Uh, but yeah, I understand how that is. I understand how it is to have uh, addictive predisposition, right? Because when I did drink, it was to get to that point, right? To get to that point where I am very, very intoxicated. All right. Okay. So yes, I suffer from all types of abuse, right? Emotional, getting beat, right? Getting whipped by a belt, getting hit in the face constantly, blood coming out, sometimes get pounded in the face, emotional neglect, emotional abuse, everything pretty much, sexual abuse. So, um, so now, what researchers have found, right, when it comes to trauma, is that you know the when traumatic events are experienced in childhood, right, they significantly, right, increase the chance for developing an alcohol use disorder, right? And another thing is very important, right, is that the severity of the trauma, the severity of the child abuse is directly connected, right, to the severity of the alcohol addiction, right? All right. So, I don't know much about my father's childhood, and I don't know a lot, obviously, about my grandparents, my grandfather's childhood. But it's a safe bet to say that they had a severe childhood because they were severely addicted to alcohol. Okay, severely addicted to alcohol. All right, and my father did tell me one time that his mother, my grandmother, put a plate of food on the table and he pushed it away, right? He said, I don't want that. And his father, my grandfather, backslapped him in the face. There was blood everywhere. So, you know, you connect the dots, right? You connect the dots. His grandfather was a heavy drinking alcoholic. So was my father. And by the way, his brother too, right? My uncle was also an alcoholic. So yeah, there was something bad going on in there in that home. Because we could see the results of that, right? We could safely assume there was something bad, very bad going on there. All right. So the severity, right? My child abuse was very severe, also, and you know, uh, when I did drink, it was you know, to that um, to that point, right? It was to get drunk, to get drunk, right? Um, so even though I didn't drink every day, right? When I did drink, I I couldn't just stop at one or two beers or three beers. I had to keep going until I was drunk. All right, so that's definitely connected to the severity of my own childhood trauma. Okay, all right, very good, very good. So now we know, right, that the severity of the childhood trauma is connected. Another thing I would like to mention is my older brother, right? He died of a drug overdose at age 30, all right? So even though uh, you know, he was not physically abused like I was, right? He was still abused, right? He was abused I'm sorry, emotionally, psychologically, uh, and then seeing me, right, his brother being beaten and treated so severely affected his mind. That was mental abuse for him. All right, so it was severe in my home. Yeah, the abuse was severe, very mental, very emotional abuse, a lot of that. that he became addicted, right? He was addicted to heroin, and that's what caused his death, right? That addiction, an overdose. So severe, severe stress in the home, severe addiction later in life. Okay, so what that shows, right? What that shows is that it proves to us, right? It shows that genetics alone do not account, don't determine uh, that a person is going to become an alcoholic, right? Genes don't do it alone. All right. Okay. So why do we tend to drink, right? People that were abused as children, right? Well, we do it too because to we do it to mitigate, right, the negative consequences, right, of early trauma, right, the anxiety, the sadness, right? The feelings of worthlessness, right? That's why people that are being abused, that's why they drink, right? So, for example, in my case, right, alcohol, right? Uh, what alcohol did for me, right, is change the feelings of inadequacy, right? Not feeling good enough, right? Um, it will change the feelings of shame, right? Uh, it will change the feelings into being confident, acceptable, right? And even important, right? So that's why we tend to drink. That's why we tend to have problems with alcohol, because alcohol changes these awful feelings that we get from childhood trauma, right? It changes those feelings. The feelings, right, of inadequacy, right, are changed, right? Are changed into feelings of, I can do it, right? I could do anything, right? And it changed those feelings of shame into feelings of confidence, right? So that's why people that you know that's why childhood trauma increases the chances of developing an alcohol problem, right? Because you can see what alcohol does, right, to a person. Okay, so people that have been abused, right? There is this thing called the ACE study, right? Adverse childhood events. Okay, and this has 10 different adverse events, right, in childhood. 10 different ones, right? If at least four of those happen, then the chances, right, of developing alcohol dependence increase 7.2 fold. All right. Okay. Now, for illicit drugs, the risk increases 4.5 fold. All right. So if a person has at least four, right? So I have five. I looked at it and I have at least five, right? So I understand why when I when I drink, I it's hard to put it down. I understand why. Okay. Now they did another study, right? Now we're talking about what how childhood affects the chances of developing alcoholism, right? And why. So they did another study. They studied rats, right? And Amini and colleagues, right, in 2002. They did a study with repeated periods of maternal separation, right, in the early life of rats. Okay, they did a study, right? Now, this what happened? What they found out that was the dopamine centers of the brain, right? the rewards system in the brain were affected, right? So this is what they found, right? They found that early life events, right, predisposes, right, people, right, to the development of alcohol abuse by directly influencing the reinforcing effects of alcohol. All right. So if a person is abused, right, the reinforcing effect of alcohol is going to be greater, right? It's going to be greater than if a person was never abused, right? And remember, I just talked about that, right? That alcohol changes feelings of worthlessness to feelings of worthiness, right? Feelings of shame into changes feelings of shame, right? From feelings of shame to feelings of confidence, right? Feelings of hopelessness into feelings of being hopeful, right? So we see why people that were traumatized as children, why alcohol, right, and other drugs too, right? Why they have such a reinforcing effect. Why children that are traumatized are high, it's a high risk for children that were traumatized to become addicted, right, to alcohol, all right, and other drugs. But today we're talking about alcohol. All right. So one more thing I want to say, right, is that emotional abuse and neglect are are also very significant. A significant a predictor of having a drinking problems, right? Emotional abuse, right? Emotional abuse and neglect, right? They were actually most often experienced by men and women with drinking problems. Okay? Emotional abuse and neglect. All right? Very, very, uh, you know, very likely to have happened, right? To people, right? They have drinking problems. Okay? All right? Very often, most often experienced. All right? Um, Okay, so they saw treatment, people with emotional abuse and neglect, they saw treatment, right? And they had higher levels of anxiety, depression, and anger, right? These men and women were impulsively, right? They were impulsively drinking, right? They were impulsively drinking, right? So their childhood trauma, you know, brought that out, right? Brought that impulsivity, right? Impulsivity. I'm sorry, that impulsive nature, right? Brought that impulsive nature, all right? And that's how they drank. They drank in an impulsive way, right? And why did they do it? To anesthetize, right? Anesthetize the feelings, right? The terrible feelings of worthlessness, shame, anger, self-hate, right? Um, and now we see why people that were traumatized, why we have a problem with substances, right? Because what substances do, right? What they actually do for us, right? Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. So now we talked about alcohol and how it affects us and how our childhood uh, predisposes us, right, to alcohol abuse. Now, we're going to see how alcohol affects the children, right? How does it affect the children, an alcoholic parent, all right? So before we go into that, I would like to say, right, that approximately 28 million children have an alcoholic parent, okay? And remember, I said before that, you know, is attributed to genetics and environmental factors, right? Okay. So remember, genetics accounts for about half of the risk, and environment accounts for the other half. All right. Um, okay. So, but one thing I want you to see, I want you to understand, is more than half of the children of alcoholics don't struggle, right, with alcohol, right? Uh, they don't struggle with the disease, right? So that means that having parents that are alcoholic, right, isn't a, it's not a sure thing that the child is going to grow up to have problems, right, with alcohol themselves, because more than half of the children of alcoholics parents don't go on to developing alcoholism. Okay. So okay, so why is it that environment is so important, and that is affected by alcoholism? All right. So, well, let's look at the structure, right? Structure in the home is very, very important. All right. Now, when when the parent, right, when a parent where their alcoholism, right, affects them in such a way, right, for the worse, right, affects the parent for the worse, that there is no concept of stability in the home, right? There's no structure, there's no stability, right? Then this can be terrible, right? Terrible for the child, right? For the child's growth, their normal development, okay? Now, also when depression, right? When depression or other uh, physiological difficulties are experienced by the parent in the midst of their alcoholism, this can also put the child at risk for developing alcoholism later in life. Okay, so remember that day-to-day life, right? Living with an alcoholic can change that day-to-day life. Okay, that means that the child really doesn't know, right? The child is guessing what normal should be like. They don't really know, right? Because they don't experience it directly. All right. So not having that structure is detrimental for the child's growth, right? For their emotional, psychological, and even physical growth, right? So what happens, right, when the parent, because due to their alcoholic nature, right, there are broken promises, right? The parent consistently falling short, right? Or falling short at meeting the child's needs, right? And so what this does is this creates a trust deficit, right, in the child, right? Uh, that can also interfere with the child's development, right? In terms of intimate relationships, right? Or even abandonment issues. All right. So the the broken promises, right? The consistently falling short, right? They start cutting away, right, at the trust that the child has, right? Okay, so things like birthdays, school, sports events, they're often forgotten, right, by the alcoholic parents. All right, so the children, they learn that they cannot trust, right, that they cannot have faith in anyone, especially their parents. All right, and another thing, so there are times when the child has to hide what they feel, right? Because they feel that their drunk parent will react if they say something, right? So they hold their feelings, right, about what they think about, their drunk parents, right, their alcoholic parents. And what happens is they are never given the freedom to express themselves, right? So not only do they not talk about the alcohol, they also don't talk about other things that might be bothering them. There might be other things that are happening that are important that the parents should know about, that the child needs help with, and they may not talk about that either. Okay, so it puts the child at risk in that way also. Okay, all right. So now, also another thing I want to say, right, is the children of alcoholic parents, feel different, right? They feel different, right? Because many times they have to take care of the alcoholic parent, right? They have to clean up their messes, right? They have to make excuses for them, right? When they act, you know, in in an embarrassing way outside, they do something, and other people find out. They have to make excuses for the parent, right? Uh, and what this has an alienating effect, on the child, right? The child feels alienated, right? Because they feel different. This is not normal. They're not supposed to be taking care of the parent, right? This is a role reversal. They're parenting the parent, right? So what happens is the child is robbed, right? He's robbed of being a child and being protected by the parents. So that is definitely uh, the child is robbed, right? The child is robbed of their childhood, and it's just terrible. It's terrible. It will have lifelong consequences for that child. Okay. All right. So now, talking about so now let's dive into the risk of the child being abused, right? Now we talked about how alcoholism of the parent affects the child, right? Itself, right? The child's emotional well-being, uh, the child's development. What about the child being abused, right? Okay, so the child of an alcoholic parent may be more likely to experience some form of abuse. However, some studies have found this to be inconclusive. All right, so that means the risk to physical and sexual abuse may be associated with having alcoholic parents, right? May be associated, but how strong this correlation is remains unclear. All right? Okay? It remains unclear, right? Now, there are three hypotheses, right, that talk about, you know, how this can be. How can having an alcoholic parent result in child abuse? Well, one hypothesis is called the cognitive disorganization hypothesis. In this hypothesis, right, uh, it says, right, the alcohol abuse, right, interferes with communication in the home, right? There's not clear communication. The threats might be seen that are not really there, right? I'm thinking this is from the parent, right? The parent might overreact to certain things. All right, so there's miscommunication, misinterpretation of social cues. All right, underestimation of the consequences of violence. All right, so this is the cognitive disorganization hypothesis. And then we have the deviance disavowal hypothesis, right? In this one, right, the perpetrator of abuse, right, blames the violence on the alcohol, so they minimize they minimize their own responsibility for the abuse, right? They blame it on the alcohol, all right? And then we have the disinhibition hypothesis, right? Uh, this one refers to alcohol's effect on the brain, right? Interfere with the actions of the brain centers that control, right? Impulsive behavior, unacceptable behavior. All right? Okay, so these three are why it is thought, how having an alcoholic parent can contribute to child abuse. Now, when it comes to uh, child sexual abuse, right? Uh, the possibility of that increases, right? Increases the vulnerability of child sexual abuse by interfering with the parent's ability, right, to provide a supportive and nurturing environment and protective environment. So you could imagine, right, if the parents' focus is alcohol, right, and getting drunk, they're not going to be able to provide that supportive, secure home, right? And so that predisposes the child to sexual abuse, right? Because they don't have that protection. They don't have that protection, right? And like I mentioned earlier, they don't have that structure. They don't have that protection. Uh, the parents could be bringing the wrong people because they're drunk, right? And they'll do, their first priority is alcohol, right? So they'll expose their children to the wrong people. They're not really watching their children, right? So they're not providing that protective, supportive environment. Okay? All right. So now we looked at uh no alcoholism and childhood trauma, how what is the connection? How does childhood trauma predisposes a child to alcoholism later in life, and how alcoholism uh, can raise the risk of child abuse, right? And so we saw that, right? Now, my father did stop drinking, right? Uh, I think I was maybe 2 or 3 years old, and so he stopped drinking, right? But there was a problem, right? My father was what we call a dry drunk, right? Now, what is a dry drunk? Okay, a dry drunk is a person that stops doing the alcohol, right, or other substances, but does not deal with the issues that made him become an alcoholic in the first place, right? So he or she stopped drinking, but never addressed the issues that uh, caused him to become an alcoholic. So that was my father's situation, right? My father has strained relationships, right, with us. He was emotionally distant with my mother. Uh, the only interaction I ever really saw him with my mother was fighting. If he wasn't fighting, he was ignoring her, right? And ignoring us, obviously. And, this lasted, through his whole life. When we got older, he got a little more combative with us, but still emotionally distant. He was never really an affectionate, uh, relational kind of person. So even though he stopped drinking, he was still, causing the family, pain and grief with his emotional neglect. All right. So yeah, they have yet to deal with the emotional baggage that led them to alcohol in the first place. All right. So it's called dry drunk syndrome, right? And this is a real psychological phenomenon. It's a real psychological phenomenon. It includes resentment toward family and friends, like I just mentioned, anger, jealousy, romanticizing their drinking days, right? My father still listened to his idol, a singer called Felipe Rodriguez, and basically, all he sang mostly about was drinking and the bar and the life of the bar. And my father still listened to him and really enjoyed his music. So he was still romanticizing the drinking days. All right. And I left you a list, all right, with all the the symptoms of dry drunk syndrome. So you can look at that yourself as well. All right. So now, what happens with dry drunk syndrome, right, is that is mainly in the head, right? It's really right here, right? So back in the 50s, right, psychologists, right, they said that working on one's inner life is the key, is the answer to getting over dry drunk syndrome, right? So not only giving the alcohol up or the drug up, but looking at what caused the addiction in the first place. All right, that will help us finally to make the last hurdle, right? Because giving up the substance is the first step, right? It's the first step. Now, if you want to have a happy life and a happy life with your family, have to work on the inside, right? What caused the the alcohol dependence? What caused that? And that could be said for all types of addiction. The same could be said for all types of addiction. Okay? What caused the addiction, right? Okay, very good. So we talked about the relationship between alcoholism and childhood trauma. And now, if you were traumatized, um, please share your experience and share how it affected you, how it affects you today. Uh, was there any alcoholism in the family? Was there alcoholism in your family? And how do you deal with it? All right. Um, please share. Please share. Is there a dry drunk in your family? Do you know a dry drunk? Please share that with us. We would really like to know. All right. So if you found this helpful, please give it a like. And if you would like to see more videos like this, uh, go ahead and subscribe. Okay? All right. So it was great to have you here. And you have yourself a wonderful day. Take care.